The annual Flaxborough Flower Show had arrived, as expected, with all the quiet excitement of a town accustomed to such affairs. The stalls were set up in the shadow of the old parish hall, draped in bunting that fluttered under the gentle English sun. There was little to distinguish this year from the others, save for the passing of time that seemed to make everything slightly smaller, quieter, less enthusiastic. But for the residents of Flaxborough, this was an event, a rare escape from the monotony of rural life. Inspector Purbright, in his usual grey suit and black tie, wandered among the flower arrangements, his eyes scanning more the faces than the petals. His presence was as unobtrusive as ever. The subtle smile that curled at the edges of his lips never quite reached his eyes. As always, the townsfolk were too busy gossiping, admiring prize dahlias, or making polite small talk with their neighbours to notice him. It was exactly as it should be. But then something odd happened. A man who looked out of place even in this setting approached one of the booths with an air of urgency. He was not from Flaxborough. His clothes were too new, his shoes too polished, his face was too sharp, his eyes too alert. Without waiting for any invitation, he reached for a vase of crimson roses, knocked it over, and then proceeded to scatter the flowers across the booth in a way that made even the most seasoned flower arranger wince. "That's it!" he barked, loud enough for several heads to turn. "The damn thing's ruined, completely ruined!" He kicked the base of the booth in frustration, causing a few onlookers to step back. Purbright raised an eyebrow, a small flicker of interest crossing his mind. The man, clearly upset, muttered something to the booth's owner, a Mrs. Trinder known for her impeccable manners and spotless reputation. As he did, the crowd's attention swiveled between the two, but the inspector didn't hurry to investigate. No, he was patient, always patient. And for now, this was nothing more than an amusing, if slightly dramatic, spectacle at an otherwise peaceful gathering. Mrs. Trinder, who had been a pillar of Flaxborough society for many years, was already beginning to blush deeply. It was quite out of character for her to be caught in a confrontation, especially in such a public manner. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice trembling but still dignified. "I think you should calm yourself. The flowers can easily be arranged again." But the man was not listening. His agitation only seemed to grow as he paced in front of the booth, muttering under his breath, "It's all wrong. Everything's wrong here." He turned sharply, glancing around the room with a look of wild confusion. Purbright, who had been quietly observing from the edge of the crowd, could not help but notice the man's peculiar behavior. There was something about him, a subtle, almost imperceptible tension in his posture. He was upset, yes, but there was also a sharpness to his movements, as though he was trying very hard to hide something beneath the surface. A few moments later, the man stopped, wiped his brow with a handkerchief, and muttered something about needing to get to the bottom of it. He turned on his heel and strode out of the hall, his back straight, his footsteps quick and purposeful. The crowd, which had been watching the scene unfold, now began to murmur among themselves. The tension lingered in the air, thick and almost palpable. What had just happened, and who exactly was this man? Purbright remained where he was, his gaze following the man's departure with mild interest. He knew better than to leap to conclusions. After all, Flaxborough was a town where nothing was ever quite as it seemed. The most innocuous of occurrences could quickly spiral into something far more complicated. A misplaced vase of flowers could be more than just a minor inconvenience. It could be the key to something far deeper. A moment later, Mrs. Trinder approached him, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her composure mostly intact. "Inspector Purbright," she began, her voice still shaking, "I do hope this won't be the subject of gossip. The man, he's from out of town, I believe. I don't know who he was, but he seemed so agitated." "Not at all, Mrs. Trinder," Purbright said calmly, his voice low and measured. "It's nothing more than a misunderstanding. I'm sure you'll have your flowers arranged in no time." He gave her a reassuring smile, but his mind was already elsewhere. There was something in the man's eyes that had caught his attention, something familiar, yet unsettling. It was the sort of thing that, once seen, couldn't easily be forgotten. As the show continued, Purbright wandered to the back of the hall, his thoughts slowly turning over the strange interruption. Mrs. Trinder would no doubt be distracted by the minor incident for the rest of the day, but Purbright had already made up his mind. The man had left more than just a trail of scattered flowers behind him. There was something far more peculiar to this interruption than anyone had yet realized. The true question wasn't about the flowers at all. It was about why someone would be so agitated, so intent on making a scene in such a quiet, unremarkable town. And more importantly, what he might be hiding. Purbright wandered for a while, taking in the faint buzz of the flower show around him, the polite clink of teacups and soft murmurs of conversation. The kind of event where time seemed to slow down, a place where nothing ever seemed urgent. And yet today something was unsettling. The odd man who had stormed off in a huff hadn't left his mind. Not that Purbright was one to jump to conclusions. He had learned better over the years. But his instinct told him that this minor disturbance was not as trivial as it appeared. He paused by the entrance, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the town square. The small crowd continued to mill about, unfazed by the spectacle, the show carrying on as if it were just another ordinary event. It wasn't long before Purbright was joined by one of the local constables, young Sergeant Crick, who approached with the casual air of someone not particularly concerned. "Everything all right, sir?" Crick asked, his tone light. He had always been the type to treat Purbright's presence with a certain amount of awe, though he hadn't quite yet learned to pick up on the subtleties of the inspector's methods. "Perfectly fine, Sergeant," Purbright replied. "Just a minor disruption. You'll hear all about it soon enough, no doubt." Crick nodded, still unsure what his superior meant. "I'll let you know if anything else happens, sir." Purbright made a non-committal gesture and turned back to the hall. He wasn't in the mood for idle chatter. His thoughts were elsewhere. The man who had caused the disturbance hadn't just been angry. He had been desperate. It was a rare thing, that kind of panic. It was something Purbright had encountered before, under far more dire circumstances. The question remained, however, what was he desperate about? He decided to take a slow walk around the perimeter of the hall, surveying the area where the man had stormed off. The alley behind the building was quiet, save for the rustling of the wind in the trees. There were a few discarded teacups and plates on a bench, remnants of the earlier refreshments. Nothing unusual, and yet something tugged at him. The man had left in such a hurry. Had he dropped something? Purbright's eyes scanned the ground, but there was nothing immediately noticeable. It wasn't until he reached the corner of the alley, where the sunlight barely reached, that he spotted it. A small crimson rose petal lay on the cobblestones, almost hidden among the shadowed cracks of the stone. A curious thing to find, given that the flowers at the show were all carefully arranged and tended to. This particular petal seemed entirely out of place. Bending down, Purbright picked it up delicately, turning it over between his fingers. It was still fresh, clearly fallen not long ago. A faint trace of something faint but distinctly wrong, lingered in the air. The scent of the flower was far too sharp, almost synthetic. It reminded him of something, but for a moment he couldn't place it. He slipped the petal into his pocket and stood up, his thoughts deepening. The man, after all, had been looking for something. and in his distress he had knocked over a perfectly beautiful display of roses. It struck Purbright as odd. The roses were far from being the most delicate flowers at the show. So why had this particular bunch set the man off? "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. As he walked back toward the hall, he saw Mrs. Trinder speaking with a couple of other vendors. She was clearly distressed, though she had regained some composure since the outburst. Purbright approached her slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Trinder," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "could you tell me more about that man? The one who caused the scene earlier? His name, perhaps?" Mrs. Trinder looked at him, still flustered. I don't know his name, Inspector. He seemed to come out of nowhere. One of those people who just doesn't fit in, if you understand what I mean." Purbright nodded, his expression unreadable. "Did he say anything to you? Anything at all?" She hesitated before answering. "Only that everything was wrong. He said the whole thing was ruined, that he was going to fix it." "Fix it?" Purbright's tone sharpened just slightly. "And what exactly did he mean by that?" "I'm not sure," she replied, shaking her head. "He was looking at the roses, and then he just started ranting. Something about getting to the bottom of it, about how it was all tied together. I tried to calm him down, but then he just stormed off." Purbright's brow furrowed. "Tied together?" "Yes, that's what he said." Mrs. Trinder lowered her voice, her eyes darting to the others nearby. "But, Inspector, I don't think he meant the flowers." Purbright considered this, his mind ticking over the possibilities. The incident was growing stranger by the moment. He had no clear answers yet, but one thing was certain. The man had known something, and he was desperate to find something, or someone. "Thank you, Mrs. Trinder," Purbright said, his voice softening. "If you remember anything else, don't hesitate to let me know." As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Crick again, standing at the edge of the hall, looking awkwardly around. The sergeant was staring at his notebook, scribbling something down, seemingly unaware of the inspector's approach. "Crick," Purbright called. "Do you know who this man was?" Crick looked up, startled. "No, sir. Just a visitor, I assume. No one seems to recognize him. I've been asking around, but no one has seen him before. We've got nothing on him, really." Purbright considered the sergeant's words. "Very well. I'll be back later. Keep your ears open. And, Crick, if you happen to spot anything unusual, let me know immediately." The sergeant nodded, but Purbright had already begun walking back toward the hall. Something told him that the key to this whole incident lay beyond just a simple outburst. It was something larger, something buried in the town's shadows. The man who had caused the disturbance was just a piece of a far greater puzzle. The thought of that petal, still warm in his pocket, gnawed at him. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The next morning, Flaxborough had returned to its usual sleepy rhythm. The sun shone lazily across the town, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The flowers from yesterday's show, though rearranged and tidied up, still lingered in the scent of the town square. The hum of the town's daily routine filled the air once more, and people moved about, going about their business, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Inspector Purbright knew better. His mind was still preoccupied with the strange disturbance at the flower show. He had spent the night going over every detail in his mind: the man's agitated behavior, the strange words he had uttered about getting to the bottom of it, and that odd, lone petal he had found in the alley, still carefully tucked into his pocket. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him. It was too deliberate, too staged, perhaps. A clue meant to be found, not an accident. Purbright found himself standing in front of the town's modest post office. He had reason to believe there was more to this incident than he could see at first glance, and the best way to start was with the details. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The small bell above the door jingled lightly, announcing his arrival. "Morning, Inspector," Mrs. Penrose, the postmistress, called out from behind the counter. She was a tall woman with a sharp nose and even sharper eyes. If anyone in Flaxborough knew anything, it would be Mrs. Penrose. She had a way of hearing things, of absorbing the rhythm of the town through her network of correspondents and customers. "Morning, Mrs. Penrose," Purbright said, tipping his hat. "I wonder if you've seen a man come through here yesterday, roughly in his 40s, dark suit, a bit agitated." She paused for a moment, her fingers briefly halting the motion of sorting the letters in front of her. "I did, actually. Came in just before noon. Didn't speak to me directly, but he did ask the postman, Mr. Kettle, about directions. Very curt, very urgent-like. Mr. Kettle mentioned he seemed upset about something. Not surprising, given the events yesterday." Purbright raised an eyebrow, a small spark of interest flaring within him. "What did he ask Mr. Kettle?" "Nothing specific, but something about needing to get somewhere quickly." Mr. Kettle wasn't quite sure where, but it was south, down towards the edge of the town. "Did you notice anything odd about him? Anything peculiar?" Mrs. Penrose thought for a moment, her gaze flicking to the window as though she could still see the man. "Not much more than what you'd expect. He was well dressed, yes, but there was a tightness in his posture, as if he was afraid of being seen, and he kept checking the time more than once. Not a normal sort of man for Flaxborough." Purbright nodded slowly, his mind turning over the fragments of the conversation. It wasn't much, but it was another piece. This man had a destination, and it was towards the southern part of the town, closer to the old mill, a place not often visited by those who didn't have business there. "Thank you, Mrs. Penrose," Purbright said, his tone quiet but appreciative. "I think that will be all for now." He stepped out of the post office and back into the bright morning air. The town square was busier now, with people making their way to the market and children playing in the streets. Purbright's gaze swept over them as he walked, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The southern part of town, the area near the old mill. It was an odd place for someone to be heading, especially someone so seemingly out of place. His steps took him down a narrow road that led away from the square. The houses here were older, the roads less tidy. It wasn't a particularly well-kept area of Flaxborough, but it was still part of the town. The further he walked, the quieter it became. The gentle chatter of the market grew distant, and soon he was left with only the soft sound of his shoes on the cobblestones and the distant murmur of the breeze. He approached the old mill, its silhouette towering against the sky. It had been out of use for years, its once bustling machinery now gathering dust. The windows were boarded up, and the stonework of the building was cracked and weathered. There were few signs of life around it, save for the occasional cat darting across the yard, or a few local children daring each other to peek inside. But there was something here, something about the way the man had been heading in this direction that made Purbright pause. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed to fit. The mill was a forgotten part of Flaxborough, but that didn't mean it lacked significance. In fact, it might have been the perfect place for someone to hide. Purbright rounded the corner of the mill and found himself on a narrow path that led toward the small canal that ran beside it. The water, though still, carried with it a sense of quiet isolation. As he walked further, his eyes scanned the ground, the bushes, the trees, anything that might have been disturbed. And then he saw it, a small, folded piece of paper caught in the underbrush. He knelt down and picked it up, unfurling it with careful hands. The paper was creased and old, as if it had been there for some time. The writing on it was sparse, but legible. "Meet me at dawn. The rose will guide you." Purbright stared at the note, a chill creeping up his spine. The rose. He thought back to the crimson petal he had found the day before, still tucked safely in his pocket. He had known there was something more to that flower than met the eye. Now, it seemed, he was beginning to understand why. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but this was only the beginning. The game was afoot, and Purbright knew he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth behind the strange, unsettling events that had started with a single, disrupted flower show. There were more questions now than answers, and the town of Flaxborough, quiet and unassuming as it appeared, was hiding far more than anyone could imagine. The road ahead would be a long one, but Purbright was ready. The truth would come to light, but only when the time was right. For now he had a new lead, and he intended to follow it wherever it might take him. The note, now tucked securely in his coat pocket, weighed heavily on Purbright's mind as he walked away from the old mill. The words, "The rose will guide you," repeated in his thoughts, mingling with the image of the crimson petal from yesterday. It all seemed too deliberate, too neat. Someone was trying to send a message disguised in symbols and half-truths. But what did it all mean? Purbright's steps grew more deliberate as he made his way back toward the town, each movement drawing him closer to an answer, though the solution remained elusive. Flaxborough had always been a town where secrets lingered just below the surface, but this felt different. There was something more sinister at play, a hidden network of motives and players whose roles had yet to be revealed. He reached the town square and noticed a few more residents were now milling about, carrying on with their daily routines. A group of women chatted near the baker's stall, while the town's butcher waved to a passing neighbour. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet everything felt off. The tension in the air was palpable, though it was invisible to the casual observer. Purbright's thoughts returned to the man from the flower show, his name still unknown, his motives unclear, but the direction of his movements pointed towards something more significant than a simple outburst. What was it he was looking for? And why had he been so focused on the roses? Was it just a coincidence, or did it tie into something larger? The more questions that arose, the more tangled the web became. But Purbright knew he couldn't rush. He had to take it one step at a time. He made his way to the local constable's office, where he found Sergeant Crick hunched over a desk, studying a collection of papers with an intensity that suggested he was deep in thought. Purbright cleared his throat softly, and the sergeant looked up, his face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Good morning, sir," Crick said, standing up quickly. "Anything I can do for you?" Purbright nodded, taking a seat. "I need you to do something for me, Crick. A bit of digging. You know the man who caused the ruckus at the flower show? I need to know everything about him. Names, addresses, anything. And see if anyone else in town might have seen him yesterday. His behavior was peculiar, and I've got a feeling this is more than just an outburst." Crick paused, looking thoughtful. "I've asked around a bit, sir. No one seems to know who he is. The vendors didn't recognize him, and he didn't exactly seem the type to be familiar with Flaxborough, but I'll look into it. You think he's connected to the mill?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. He had been to the mill, of course, but the idea that the stranger could be connected to that isolated place troubled him. "It's a possibility. Just follow up on any leads you can. Keep your ear to the ground. I have a feeling that the town's quiet days might be numbered." Crick nodded, determination settling on his face. "Understood, sir." As Purbright left the office, he glanced over his shoulder to see the sergeant already pulling out his notebook, jotting down notes with a new sense of urgency. It was good to have Crick on his side, young, eager, and willing to follow through on anything the inspector asked. But it was still early. The pieces of this puzzle were scattered, and Purbright knew better than to trust a single lead. The sky had begun to cloud over, a subtle shift in the weather that added a sense of foreboding to the day. Purbright adjusted his coat against the growing chill and walked down the main street, heading toward his small office tucked behind the town hall. His mind was a tangle of thoughts as he mulled over the events of the previous day. The rose, the note, the man who seemed desperate to find something. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting to be discovered. When he reached his office, Purbright stepped inside and set about making himself a pot of tea. The warmth from the kettle was a welcome contrast to the cool air outside. He sat at his desk, carefully unrolling the note again. The words seemed to mock him, taunting him with their simplicity. The rose will guide you. It wasn't much to go on, and yet Purbright knew it was important. He had seen enough of life's undercurrents to know that messages like this were rarely innocuous. The rose could mean anything, or it could mean everything. He picked up the petal from his pocket, now beginning to wilt, and studied it once more. Was it just a random piece of the arrangement, a careless detail from a flower show, or did it belong to something far more significant? The color? The scent? It was all wrong. There was something artificial about it, something that didn't belong. The door creaked open behind him and Purbright turned just as Crick entered, his face flushed with excitement. "Sir, I've got something," Crick said, his voice low but urgent. "You were right. I found something." Purbright set the petal down carefully and gestured for the sergeant to continue. "What is it?" Crick stepped forward, holding up a small bundle of papers. "I spoke to the postman, Mr. Kettle. He remembered that the man who caused the scene at the flower show had been asking about the mill. I followed up on the name he gave me, a Mr. James Harrow. Seems he's been in and out of Flaxborough for a while. Nothing concrete, just passing through. But here's the thing, sir. I checked with the local registry. There's no record of him, no address, no family. And there's something else." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Mr. Harrow has a history. Not much, but enough to make me think he's been involved in some unsavory business in other towns. He's connected to some minor scandals. Nothing violent, but questionable. There's no direct connection to Flaxborough's local history, but I'm sure he's hiding something." Purbright sat back, his mind racing. "He's hiding something," he repeated softly. "But what?" Crick shrugged, clearly as puzzled as his superior. "I don't know yet, but we're getting closer." Purbright stood up, his mind now racing with possibilities. "We're on the right track, Crick. Keep digging. This is only the beginning." The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent as Purbright walked through the narrow streets of Flaxborough, his mind still circling around the latest developments. Crick's findings about James Harrow were intriguing, but they raised more questions than answers. A man who could slip through the cracks of the town's records was one thing, but a man with a history of unsavory behavior, particularly one who had caused such a stir at the flower show, was something entirely different. Purbright found himself at the edge of the town, where the streets grew quieter and the buildings became more sparse. The houses here were fewer and farther apart, their facades worn by years of neglect. It was an area that Flaxborough's more prosperous residents had long since left behind, a place that felt as though it was slowly being forgotten. And yet it was here that Purbright felt he might find an answer, or at least a clue that could lead him closer to the heart of this mystery. He arrived at the gate of a small cottage at the far end of the street. The overgrown ivy and the neglected garden made the house look abandoned, though a faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney. It was the sort of house no one would expect to find a person like James Harrow. If there was anyone in town who could blend into the background, it was him. And now, it seemed, he was hiding somewhere just out of sight, beneath the veneer of Flaxborough's everyday life. Purbright approached the door with careful steps, his hand reaching out to knock before he hesitated. It was a small gesture, but it seemed like the right one. The door opened before he could knock a second time, revealing a woman who was much older than he had expected. Her sharp eyes were a match for the lines that marred her face, and her posture, though slightly stooped, still carried the air of someone who had seen much more than the town could offer. "Can I help you, Inspector?" she asked, her voice firm but not unfriendly. Purbright studied her for a moment, considering the best way to introduce himself. "I'm looking for a man named James Harrow. I understand he's been staying here. I was hoping you could help me locate him." The woman's expression didn't change, but the faintest twitch of her brow suggested she was trying to place the name. "Harrow, you say?" "Yes, I've heard of him. A quiet man. Mostly keeps to himself." "Do you know where I can find him?" Purbright pressed, his tone polite, but insistent. The woman's lips pursed, as though she was debating whether to tell him anything further. After a moment, she sighed. "He's not here now. Left early this morning. Said he was heading out to the far side of town. He's been a regular visitor, but never stays long. Always seems in a hurry, always seems to be running from something." Purbright took a step forward, intrigued. "Running from something? Did he ever tell you anything about his past? Where he's from?" She shook her head slowly. "No, Inspector, he never spoke of his past, just comes and goes, not much for conversation. But there was one thing that always seemed odd." "What's that?" Purbright asked, leaning in slightly. The woman lowered her voice, as if to ensure no one else could overhear. "He always carried a rose with him, no matter where he went. A single crimson rose, always in his hand or tucked into his coat. I thought it was strange. It wasn't like any of the flowers he had in the garden here. It was different. Artificial, almost." Purbright's mind whirred as the woman's words sank in. A crimson rose. It was the same flower that had caused the outburst at the flower show, the same flower that had lingered in his thoughts for days. The connection was undeniable now. This wasn't just a coincidence. Harrow's fixation on the rose was central to whatever was happening in Flaxborough. And it wasn't just about flowers, it was about something far deeper. "Do you know where he went today?" Purbright asked, his voice barely a whisper now, as though the very question might lead him down an unexpected path. The woman nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "He mentioned something about heading out to the old churchyard, said he needed to go there but didn't explain why. I didn't ask, I didn't want to know." Purbright felt a flicker of unease. The old churchyard was a place rarely visited, its crumbling stones and forgotten graves a remnant of the town's past. But there was no time to waste. He needed to see it for himself, needed to find Harrow before he vanished again, taking whatever secrets he held with him. "Thank you," Purbright said, his voice softer now, grateful for the woman's cooperation. He turned on his heel, heading back toward the town centre. As he walked, his thoughts raced. The churchyard. It had always been a place of mystery, a place where the past seemed to cling to every stone. But what could Harrow be doing there? Was it just another place to hide, or was there something more to it? The rose, the secrecy, the urgency in Harrow's every movement. All of it pointed to something dark, something hidden beneath the surface of Flaxborough's sleepy exterior. Purbright reached the edge of town and followed the path toward the churchyard. The sky had begun to darken, the clouds pressing down as though a storm were on the horizon. He could hear the faint rustle of the trees as the wind picked up, the air turning colder with each passing step. When he arrived at the churchyard, the first thing that struck him was the silence. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint creaking of the old gravestones, their inscriptions worn by time. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the weight of the past were pressing in on him from all sides. Purbright moved cautiously through the graves, his eyes scanning for any sign of Harrow. The place felt abandoned, untouched for years. Yet he could sense that someone had been here recently. The grass had been trampled in places, the earth disturbed in others, as though someone had been digging, or perhaps looking for something. He knelt by a grave at the far end of the yard, where the ground seemed fresher, less settled. A single crimson rose lay on the stone, its petals still vibrant despite the surrounding decay. Purbright's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary flower. The significance of it was undeniable now. The rose wasn't just a symbol, it was a marker. Harrow had left it here for a reason. Purbright stood, his mind racing. Whatever Harrow had been searching for, whatever connection he had to this place, it was clear that the mystery had only deepened. Flaxborough's quiet streets were hiding something far darker, something Purbright was determined to uncover, and he knew now that it was only a matter of time before the truth would finally come to light. As he turned to leave, a figure appeared at the far end of the churchyard, moving toward him. It was Harrow. Purbright's breath caught in his throat as the figure approached. Harrow, the man who had eluded him, who had been at the center of everything, was finally here. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though he knew Purbright had been watching him. His face was drawn and pale, the lines around his eyes deeper than before, as if the weight of something heavy had taken its toll on him. Purbright stood motionless, his eyes locked on Harrow. For a moment, the two men regarded each other in silence, the air thick with the unspoken tension that had been building for days. Harrow didn't seem surprised to see Purbright, nor did he appear particularly worried. Instead, there was a certain resignation in his posture, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Well, Inspector," Harrow said, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "I suppose you've been following me." Purbright said nothing at first, his gaze shifting to the rose that lay on the gravestone before returning to Harrow. "I've been trying to find you," he replied quietly. "Trying to understand what's going on." Harrow took a step closer, his eyes flicking to the ground where the rose lay. "It's not what you think," he muttered, almost to himself. "It was never about the flowers." Purbright's interest piqued at the mention of the flowers, but he didn't press. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, watching as Harrow seemed to struggle with something inside him. The tension in the air was palpable, the sense that Harrow was holding back some crucial piece of information. Finally, Harrow spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, none of you do. This place, this town, it's all connected, all of it. The rose, the churchyard, the things buried here, they're all tied to something much darker." Purbright's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean? What's buried here?" Harrow hesitated, looking around as though to make sure they weren't being overheard. Then in a voice so low it was almost a growl, he said, "There's a secret in Flaxborough. Something that's been hidden for years. It's been buried in this churchyard, and it's been waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for someone to uncover the truth." Purbright's mind raced. A secret? Buried in the churchyard? It was becoming clear that Harrow was more than just an unwitting visitor to Flaxborough. He was part of something much bigger, something rooted in the very history of the town. "And you think the rose has something to do with it?" Purbright asked, his voice steady but urgent. Harrow nodded slowly. "The rose. It's the key. It's always been the key. I didn't know it at first, but now I do. It was meant to lead me here, to this grave, to this spot. There's something underneath it, something I need to find before it's too late." Purbright's mind was whirling. The rose, the cryptic note, the strange behavior. It was all coming together in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was something buried in this town, something the town's residents had kept hidden for years. The question now was, what was it? And why had Harrow become so desperate to uncover it? "Why now?" Purbright asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "Why come to Flaxborough now, after all this time?" Harrow's eyes darkened, his voice dropping even further as he spoke. "Because they're watching. They've always been watching. I thought I could run, but they won't let me. They know I'm getting close, and they'll do anything to stop me." Purbright felt a chill creep down his spine. "Who are they?" Harrow shook his head, his face twisted in a mix of fear and determination. "I can't tell you, not yet. But they're everywhere. In this town, watching every step I take. They know what I've been trying to uncover." The air around them seemed to grow thicker, the weight of Harrow's words pressing down on Purbright. A secret buried in Flaxborough, a hidden past that someone, or something, wanted to remain forgotten. And now Harrow was trying to unearth it, but at what cost? "You've got to help me, Inspector," Harrow said suddenly, his voice growing desperate. "You've got to help me find it before they do." Purbright stood there for a moment, considering his options. He could walk away. Let Harrow go, let him chase his own secrets. But Purbright knew that wasn't possible. There was too much at stake, too many unanswered questions. Harrow's desperation was palpable, and Purbright's instincts told him that the man wasn't lying. At least, not about everything. There was something here, something buried deep in Flaxborough, and Harrow was the key to unlocking it. "All right," Purbright said finally, his voice calm and steady. "I'll help you, but we do this my way. We'll go to the grave, and we'll find whatever it is you're looking for, but no more secrets, no more running." Harrow seemed to sag with relief, though his eyes still carried that same haunted look. "Thank you, Inspector. You don't know how much this means." Without another word, Purbright turned and motioned for Harrow to follow. Together they walked toward the grave where the rose lay, the weight of the secret pressing on them both. Flaxborough had always been a quiet town, a place where nothing ever really happened. But now, it seemed, everything was about to change. They reached the grave, and Harrow immediately began to kneel beside it, brushing the overgrown grass aside. His hands trembled as he carefully moved the stone slab that covered the burial site. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breath, the rustling of the leaves, and the distant hum of the wind. Then, with a final heave, the stone moved, revealing a small, weathered box hidden beneath it. Harrow reached for it with trembling hands, his eyes wide with both fear and anticipation. The truth was within his grasp, and yet Purbright couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was lurking just beneath the surface. Harrow opened the box slowly, and the contents glinted in the fading light. A small, crumpled piece of paper, stained with age, and a single crimson rose, the same one he had been carrying all this time. The moment the box was open, a tense silence enveloped the graveyard. Harrow's trembling hands barely moved as he unfurled the crumpled paper inside, his eyes scanning the faint ink smudges. Purbright, standing just behind him, felt a growing unease settle deep in his stomach. Whatever this was, whatever secret Harrow had been chasing, it was about to become far more real, far more dangerous than he had imagined. Harrow read the paper quickly, his lips moving as he silently deciphered the words. The grim expression on his face hardened, his gaze lifting slowly to meet Purbright's. There was a coldness to his eyes now, a depth of understanding that Purbright had not seen before. "It's here," Harrow said quietly, his voice low and rough. "It's all in here. What we've been looking for, what I've been running from all this time. The answers, the truth. It's all buried beneath Flaxborough." Purbright remained silent, watching the man carefully. He had known there was more to this town's past than met the eye, but the way Harrow spoke now suggested that the stakes were far higher than just a small-town mystery. There was something far darker hidden in the fabric of Flaxborough, something that stretched beyond time, beyond the quaint streets and familiar faces. "What does it say?" Purbright asked finally, his voice steady, despite the growing tension in the air. Harrow's fingers tightened around the paper as he scanned the words again. "It's a map of the town, but not the Flaxborough you know, the one that was here before, the one buried beneath it all. There's something underneath this town, something buried in the old chapel. The rose, it's not just a symbol, it's a marker." Purbright leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "A marker for what?" Harrow's gaze shifted toward the churchyard, his expression darkening. "For the vault that's hidden under the chapel. It's where they stored everything, secrets, treasures, things people didn't want anyone to find. They thought it was lost, but it's still there, waiting." The weight of Harrow's words settled over Purbright like a heavy fog. A hidden vault? Something beneath Flaxborough itself, a secret long buried beneath the chapel? It sounded like something out of a history book, a relic of an age long past. But the urgency in Harrow's voice, the conviction in his words, told Purbright that this wasn't just folklore or an old legend. Whatever had been hidden in that vault had been waiting for someone to uncover it. And now, that someone was Harrow. Purbright took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The pieces were finally starting to come together. The outburst at the flower show, the strange behavior, the secret note, the crimson rose, it was all part of something much larger. But what had Harrow discovered that made him so desperate to find this vault? What was in that box, in the chapel, that had driven him to the edge? "How do you know all this?" Purbright asked, his voice quieter now, though the tension in the air was palpable. "Why is it so important?" Harrow looked away, his expression hardening once again. He took a step back from the grave, as though distancing himself from the secret they were about to uncover. "Because my family was involved. They were the ones who hid it all. They were the ones who set it in motion. And now it's my turn to finish what they started." Purbright felt a chill ripple through him. The notion of family involvement, of something so deeply buried in the town's past, was beginning to feel less like a mystery and more like a warning. Whatever Harrow's family had done, whatever had been locked away beneath the chapel, it was clearly more than just a relic of the past. It was something that had never truly been forgotten, only buried deep in the collective memory of the town. Harrow turned toward the chapel, his eyes narrowing as though he could already see the vault beneath the earth. "There's a ritual, you know," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A way to unlock it, a way to open the vault. That's why the rose was always with me. It's part of the key." "The rose? It's part of the ritual?" Purbright asked, his mind racing to catch up. It was all too surreal, too tangled in symbols and half-hidden truths. Harrow nodded, Not just the rose, the petal, the way it's placed, the timing. It all has to align. I thought it was just superstition at first, but now I see it. Everything points to the chapel. Everything points to this moment. The vault, what's inside, could change everything. The truth about Flaxborough, the truth about my family. It all ends here. Purbright felt a sharp pang of apprehension. There was something more here, something that Harrow wasn't saying, something that could make all of this far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And it was clear that Harrow had only just begun to scratch the surface. "We need to go to the chapel," Purbright said, his voice firm. "We need to find this vault, and we need to know what's hidden there." Harrow's eyes flickered to Purbright, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "It's time." The two men began their walk toward the chapel, their footsteps echoing against the quiet of the graveyard. As they passed through the old iron gate and moved toward the crumbling structure of the chapel, Purbright couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the heart of something much darker than they realized. The chapel loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the fading light of the evening sky. The stone walls, weathered by centuries of neglect, seemed to whisper of secrets long buried. Purbright could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the very air thick with the knowledge of what had come before. When they reached the chapel door, Harrow paused, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. The sound of the hinges creaked in the silence, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow them whole. Inside, the air was cool, the scent of old wood and stone mingling with the dampness of years of disuse. "This is it," Harrow whispered, his voice barely audible in the dim light. Purbright stepped forward, his eyes scanning the space. The chapel was empty, save for the scattered remnants of what had once been a place of worship. Broken pews, cracked stained-glass windows, and the remnants of faded tapestries lined the walls. Harrow moved toward the altar, his eyes fixed on a particular spot in the stone floor. He knelt, running his fingers along the cracks in the ancient stone, as if searching for something hidden beneath. "It's here," he said softly, his voice reverent. "The vault, it's right under us." Purbright watched as Harrow's fingers found a narrow seam in the stone. With a grunt of effort, Harrow pressed down on it, and slowly the stone began to shift. A low rumble echoed in the chapel as the floor began to move, revealing a dark, narrow opening beneath. Without a word, Harrow descended into the darkness, and Purbright followed, his heart racing. They had crossed the threshold now, and whatever lay beneath Flaxborough, whatever secret had been hidden for so long, was about to be revealed. As Purbright descended into the darkened opening beneath the chapel, his breath felt heavier in the stale air, the sense of anticipation thickening with each step. The walls of the narrow passage were cold to the touch, the stone smooth and worn from centuries of neglect. The faint scent of earth and decay clung to the damp, oppressive atmosphere. Every step took them deeper into the bowels of Flaxborough's forgotten past, and with it a growing sense of unease gnawed at Purbright's gut. Harrow, now ahead of him, moved with a determined urgency, his face illuminated only by the dim light of a flickering lantern. His shadow stretched across the walls, twisting like some dark spectre. Purbright could sense the tension in his movements, the desperation in his grip on the lantern. This wasn't just about a vault or a secret anymore. Harrow was running from something or someone, and whatever was hidden in this place was the only thing keeping him from being caught. The path before them narrowed further, and the air grew colder still. Purbright's feet shuffled against the loose stones and earth, his thoughts racing. What was so important that it had to be buried here, under the chapel? And what was it that Harrow's family had hidden so carefully, passed down through the generations. They reached the bottom of the staircase, and Harrow pushed forward with renewed determination, his eyes locked on a section of the wall that seemed far too deliberate in its construction. It was an archway, partially hidden by thick layers of dust and cobwebs, but the stones around it were arranged with a strange symmetry that felt entirely out of place compared to the surrounding walls. Harrow stopped before it, his breathing labored, as though he had reached the threshold of something monumental. "This is it," Harrow muttered, his voice shaking slightly with the weight of his own revelation. "The vault is behind here. The key is the rose, Purbright. The rose is the symbol, the mark of the family's secret." Purbright, his instincts now fully engaged, studied the archway. "How do you know this is the right place?" Harrow didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the same crimson rose that had been with him since the flower show. His hand shook as he held it up to the archway, his fingers tracing the edges of the delicate petals. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, whispering something under his breath that Purbright couldn't catch. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, Harrow pressed the rose against the stone, where a small indentation was barely visible. The effect was immediate. There was a low, rumbling sound, followed by the grinding of stone against stone. The floor beneath them seemed to shift, and the wall before them slowly began to open, revealing a dark passage leading deeper into the earth. Purbright's heart raced as the door creaked open, the darkness beyond swallowing up the faint light from the lantern. "We're in," Harrow said softly, almost reverently, as he stepped forward. Purbright followed without hesitation, his mind racing. The air was thick with the weight of history now, the vault just ahead. Every instinct told him this was it, the culmination of everything that had been building. They were about to uncover the truth. The tunnel stretched out before them, the walls lined with old, weathered stone. It felt as though the air itself had become heavier with each step they took. They passed narrow corridors, each one darker than the last, until finally the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The floor was littered with centuries-old debris, bits of broken pottery, shards of glass, and remnants of what had once been objects of value, now lost to time. At the far end of the room, illuminated by the flickering light of the lantern, stood a large stone pedestal. Resting atop it was an ornate chest, covered in dust and cobwebs, but unmistakably out of place in the desolation of the room. Harrow's eyes were fixed on it, a look of awe and fear crossing his face as he stepped forward. "This is it," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The family vault, everything they tried to keep hidden, it's all in there." Purbright approached cautiously, his gaze moving from the chest to Harrow. The man was almost trembling now, his fingers trembling as he reached for the chest's heavy lid. The vault had been hidden for so long, buried beneath layers of secrecy and time. Whatever it contained was bound to have repercussions, not just for Harrow's family, but for the entire town of Flaxborough. As Harrow slowly lifted the lid, a thick cloud of dust billowed out from the chest, momentarily obscuring their vision. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the stillness of the chamber pressing in around them. Then, as the dust settled, Purbright could see what was inside. The chest contained a single object, a large, weathered book, its cover adorned with strange, intricate symbols that Purbright had never seen before. The pages were yellowed with age, and the leather was cracked and worn, but it was unmistakable. This was what Harrow had been searching for. This was the key to the town's darkest secret. Harrow's hands shook as he reached for the book, lifting it carefully from the chest. His eyes gleamed with something that Purbright couldn't quite place: fear, excitement, and something darker. This wasn't just about uncovering a secret anymore. Harrow was desperate, as though this book held not just the answers, but something much more personal. Purbright watched silently as Harrow opened the book, the pages creaking with age as he flipped through them. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning the text with an intensity that suggested he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Do you understand what it says?" Purbright asked quietly, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Harrow didn't answer at first. He just stared at the pages, his face a mix of disbelief and recognition. "It's all here, Purbright, all of it. The story of my family, the reason they hid everything, the reason they buried it beneath the town." Purbright stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the book. "What's the story, Harrow? What are you looking for?" Harrow's eyes lifted from the pages, his expression hardening. "It's the legacy of my family. They made a pact, generations ago, to bury the truth, to hide what they had done. And now I see what it all meant." Before Purbright could ask more, a sudden noise echoed from the darkened tunnel behind them, a low, ominous creak that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. Harrow's eyes shot toward the entrance, his expression turning to one of dread. "They're here," Harrow whispered, the fear in his voice unmistakable. Purbright's instincts kicked in. Someone else had followed them, someone who had been waiting for this moment, just like Harrow. The vault was no longer just a secret. It had become a battlefield, and the truth inside was more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The creaking sound grew louder, echoing through the chamber as Harrow's expression twisted into something between panic and determination. He slammed the book shut with a force that made the dust rise once more, the faint thud reverberating in the stone walls. He looked at Purbright, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and urgency. "They're not far," Harrow whispered, his voice thin with fear. "You don't understand. They've always known. They've been waiting for this moment." Purbright's heart skipped a beat. Whoever they were close, and they were ready to act. The air around them seemed to tighten, the silence of the vault turning suffocating. He turned to Harrow, his mind racing. There was no time to hesitate now. They had to act, and fast. "Who are they, Harrow?" Purbright asked sharply, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "Who's coming for us?" Harrow's face twisted in a grimace as he gripped the book tighter, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. "My family's legacy. There are those who've been sworn to protect it. They've been hiding in plain sight in this town, watching everything. And now that we've found the vault, they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays buried." The weight of Harrow's words hit Purbright like a physical blow. This wasn't just about uncovering an old secret. It was about protecting something, keeping it hidden from the world. And now, with the book in their hands, they had become a target. Whoever these people were, they were prepared to do anything to keep this buried. Purbright's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, his instincts kicking in. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't let themselves be trapped in this underground vault. If they did, they'd never leave. "We need to move, now," Purbright urged, his voice urgent but controlled. "We'll figure out who they are later, but right now, we need to get out of here before they find us." Harrow nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the book. It was as if he were torn between leaving and staying, between escaping the threat that was closing in and unraveling the last of the mystery his family had buried. Purbright reached out, grabbing Harrow's arm and pulling him toward the narrow passage that led back to the chapel. "Come on," Purbright said, his grip tightening. "We're not alone anymore." With a reluctant nod, Harrow followed Purbright, but not without a glance over his shoulder at the vault they were leaving behind. The weight of the book in his hand seemed to grow heavier with every step they took. Purbright didn't have time to worry about it. He had seen Harrow's desperation before. This wasn't just a quest for answers. It was a battle for something far more dangerous. The passage was just as dark and oppressive on their way out as it had been when they entered. The echo of their footsteps seemed to amplify in the cramped tunnel, each sound a reminder that they were being hunted. They reached the chapel's entrance and burst through the door, back into the relative safety of the night air. Purbright paused for a moment at the threshold, his eyes scanning the area. It was quiet now, too quiet. The churchyard, once so full of life and memories, now felt like a graveyard. Something was wrong. They weren't alone. As if on cue, a figure stepped out from the shadows by the church's rear wall, emerging silently like a predator in the night. Purbright tensed, his body instinctively taking a step back. He couldn't make out much in the dim light, but the figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and exuded an air of menace that made Purbright's skin crawl. Harrow's face went pale, the book still gripped tightly in his hands. He froze, his gaze locked on the figure, and for a brief moment Purbright saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Damien," Harrow muttered under his breath, a single word heavy with meaning. "I should have known you'd be here." Purbright's eyes flicked between Harrow and the figure, now stepping closer, his face obscured by a hood. There was no mistaking the tension in the air. The figure had arrived with purpose, and it was clear from Harrow's reaction that this wasn't a coincidence. Whoever this man was, he was dangerous. And he was here for the book. "Hand it over, Harrow," the figure said, his voice low and commanding, yet calm. "You know
why I'm here." Harrow took a step back, the book still clutched tightly to his chest. "I won't let you take it. Not after all these years. It's my family's legacy. It's mine." The figure chuckled darkly, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "You think you can protect it? You think you can keep this secret forever? Your family's made mistakes, Harrow. I'm just here to make sure those mistakes stay buried." Purbright didn't need any more clues to know that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The man wasn't here to talk. He was here to take whatever Harrow had, by force if necessary. And Purbright wasn't going to let that happen. With quick reflexes, Purbright reached for the lantern, swinging it toward the figure with the intent of blinding him. The sudden movement caught the man off guard, and he staggered back, temporarily blinded by the light. "Run!" Purbright barked at Harrow. Harrow didn't need to be told twice. Without looking back, he bolted into the night, the book still clutched in his hands. Purbright followed suit, his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted after Harrow. They had to escape. The figure was still recovering, but Purbright knew it was only a matter of time before he regrouped. They were being hunted, and if they didn't move quickly, they wouldn't make it out of Flaxborough alive. They raced down the overgrown path leading away from the chapel, the sound of their footsteps echoing into the night. The figure's voice, low and menacing, echoed after them. "You can't outrun me, Harrow. You can't outrun your family's sins. You'll never escape." Purbright's pulse quickened. The chase had begun, and the truth about Flaxborough, about Harrow's family, was about to unravel faster than either of them could have predicted. The sound of their hurried footsteps echoed through the narrow, winding streets as Purbright and Harrow fled, the cold night air rushing past them. Behind them, the distant shouts of the figure, still recovering from the blinding lantern light, grew fainter. But Purbright knew it wouldn't be long before their pursuer caught up. The town, despite its sleepy facade, was a maze of alleys and hidden passages, a labyrinth, just like the secrets it held. Harrow's breath came in ragged gasps, his pace unsteady as he clutched the book tightly to his chest. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, his mind racing.
but it was clear he was not fully in control of his movements. The desperation in his expression was unmistakable. He had been running from something far bigger than himself, something that had been chasing him his whole life. Now it seemed it was closing in. "Where are we going?" Purbright asked, his voice sharp but calm, the only constant in a world that had suddenly spiraled out of control. "We can't keep running blindly, Harrow." Harrow didn't answer right away. His eyes were wide, his mind clearly still, processing the events unfolding around him. "The river," he finally muttered. "We have to get to the river. It's the only way out. They won't follow us there." Purbright's instincts told him to question the idea. The river? It seemed too simple, too easy. But there was no time to argue. They had to make a decision, and they had to make it fast. If they stayed on the streets, they would be trapped. The figure would eventually catch up to them. "All right," Purbright said, his tone clipped. "The river it is, but we're not going in blind. We need to stick to the shadows and keep quiet. We can't risk being seen." They turned sharply down another narrow alley, the houses closing in around them like silent witnesses to the chaos unfolding. The night seemed to have swallowed them whole, the only sound now the thudding of their footsteps and their ragged breathing. The moon hung overhead, a faint sliver in the sky, offering no more light than the lantern they had left behind. They moved quickly, ducking behind a pile of discarded crates and slipping through an iron gate into the quiet streets that led to the riverbank. The area was far less populated than the town centre, with only the occasional flicker of a lamp casting a brief, unsteady light across the cobblestones. Purbright's eyes scanned the shadows, but they seemed empty. No sign of pursuit, not yet. Harrow didn't slow, his eyes fixed on the distant curve of the river. The way he moved was purposeful, almost instinctive, as though he knew this path well. And Purbright couldn't help but wonder, had Harrow been here before? Had he planned this escape for years? Or was this all part of a desperate, last-minute scramble? They reached the river's edge, the water flowing silently beneath the old stone bridge. Harrow paused for a moment, looking down at the dark water, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was clearly conflicted, torn between the urgency of the moment and the weight of what he was carrying, the book, the family's legacy. It was the reason they were running, the reason they had to hide. "We can't just keep running," Purbright said quietly, his voice low but firm. He placed a hand on Harrow's shoulder, steadying him. "We need to face this. Whatever's been chasing you, it's not just going to go away. We have to confront it." Harrow's face twisted in pain, the flickering lantern light casting shadows across his features. "I don't know if I can, Purbright. I've spent my whole life trying to run from this, from what they've done. I thought I could keep it buried. But now it's all coming for me." Purbright studied him for a moment, weighing his options. He could sense the depth of Harrow's fear, the toll this chase had taken on him. But he also knew that they couldn't run forever. The truth, whatever it was out there, and it was closing in. "We'll face it together," Purbright said, his voice steady.
Unwavering. "But not here. Not now. We need to keep moving." Harrow looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed as if the weight of the situation was too much for him to bear. But then slowly he nodded, his resolve hardening. He turned away from the river and headed toward the small, hidden boat dock further down the bank. The wooden planks creaked underfoot as he made his way to a narrow rowboat tied to a rusted post. "We'll take the boat," Harrow said, his voice a bit more steady now, though still laced with the tension of what was to come. "It's the only way to get out of town without being seen. We can go downstream, head to the next town. From there, we'll figure out what to do." Purbright didn't argue. There was no time. They had to leave Flaxborough, at least for now. Whatever was waiting for them, whatever had been chasing Harrow and his family, would find them sooner or later. But for tonight, they had an opportunity to escape, and Purbright wasn't about to let it slip away. They pushed the boat out into the river, the water gliding beneath them like liquid glass. The night was thick with shadows, the town of Flaxborough slowly receding into the distance. The only sound now was the gentle ripple of the river against the boat and the distant hoot of an owl. Harrow picked up the oars and began to row, his movements quick but deliberate. Purbright sat at the back of the boat, his eyes scanning the darkness, his mind running through every detail of what had happened so far. There was no doubt in his mind now. This wasn't just about a family secret or a buried past. It was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As the boat drifted further from Flaxborough, Purbright's thoughts lingered on the book, the legacy of Harrow's family, and the dark figure who had been chasing them. Whoever they weren't done. And neither was the mystery. But for now, Purbright had one goal: to get them both to safety. The answers, the truth, would come in time. But tonight, they needed to escape, and that was all that mattered. Suddenly there was a sound, faint at first but growing louder, a splash in the distance. Purbright's head snapped around, his heart leaping in his chest. Someone was behind them. They weren't alone on the river. "Row faster!" Purbright urged, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got company!" Harrow's hands gripped the oars tightly, his knuckles turning white as he shoved them through the water with desperate urgency. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the dark river, but Purbright could hear it too. The unmistakable sound of something following them, disturbing the stillness of the water. A soft splash, growing louder, closer. It wasn't a natural sound, not the gentle ripple of water disturbed by a bird or a fish, but the telltale movement of something or
someone pursuing them from the shadows. Purbright leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into the distance. He couldn't see anything in the blackness beyond the faint reflection of the moonlight on the water, but he could feel it. Something was closing in. "Keep rowing," Purbright said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. "Don't stop. Whatever's back there, we can't afford to slow down." Harrow didn't answer. His face was pale, lit only by the dim glow of the distant town's lights, now a blur behind them. His eyes flicked over his shoulder, scanning the darkness, but he rowed with determination, each stroke bringing them further away from Flaxborough, but it also brought them further into the unknown. Purbright's gaze remained locked on the water behind them, straining for any sign of their pursuer. The noise continued, just out of sight, but the rhythmic splash grew louder and more frantic. It wasn't just the sound of a person in a boat. There was something erratic, frantic, almost unnatural about it. A creeping sensation settled deep in his gut. Whoever or whatever was following them, they were getting closer, fast. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows of the riverbank, its silhouette a dark mass against the tree-lined shore. Purbright's breath caught in his throat. The figure moved quickly, far too fast for someone merely walking along the river. Then came the unmistakable sound of a splash, followed by another, and then more, like something entering the water. "They've followed us!" Harrow hissed, his eyes wide in fear, as he glanced back, terror flashing in his face. "We're not alone. They're coming for the book." Purbright's mind raced as he assessed the situation. He wasn't going to outrun whatever was chasing them. There was no time to think, only to act. "Harrow, stop!" Purbright shouted, his voice commanding. Harrow didn't hesitate, his strokes faltering as he brought the boat to a slow, shuddering halt. The boat was drifting now, caught between the current and the sense of impending danger. They both knew what was coming, but neither of them wanted to confront it head-on. "What do we do?" Harrow asked, his voice shaky, panicked now. Purbright scanned their surroundings. The water was wide and still ahead of them, but the banks were too steep for a quick escape. To the left, the faint shape of a small inlet barely visible in the darkness might offer a chance. If they could reach it, hide, perhaps they could buy some time. "There's an inlet," Purbright said quickly, pointing toward the faint shadow of the trees. "We need to get to it, now." Harrow didn't wait to question it. He steered the boat with frantic precision toward the inlet, the oars slicing through the water with speed that mirrored the desperation in their hearts. Purbright kept watch, his breath shallow, his senses alert to every movement behind them. The sounds of splashing had intensified, echoing like the approach of something relentless, something determined to close the distance. As they neared the inlet, a rush of cold air swept over them, the night growing even darker in the absence of the moon's light. The trees ahead loomed like sentinels, shadows casting eerie shapes across the water. Harrow was now pushing the boat into the narrow passage between the trees, maneuvering them into the thickening underbrush that lined the bank. "Get ready," Purbright muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver he kept in his coat pocket. "Stay low." The boat slipped silently into the narrow passage, its hull scraping against the hidden branches as they entered the shadows of the overhanging trees. The sounds from the river were muffled now, the eerie splashing growing more distant as the inlet swallowed them whole. Purbright held his breath, listening. The faint rustle of the trees above was the only sound he could hear for a few moments, but then, just as they drifted deeper into the darkness, the unmistakable sound of something pushing through the water behind them became clear again. Louder this time, closer. Harrow's breathing was ragged, his eyes flicking nervously between Purbright and the darkening river behind them. "They're right behind us," he whispered, the terror in his voice palpable. "We're not safe here." Purbright knew Harrow was right. The inlet offered no real protection, only a brief moment of concealment. They would be trapped soon if they didn't act. He looked around quickly, his mind working in overdrive. There had to be a way to throw off whoever or whatever was chasing them. They needed more time. Purbright's eyes landed on a thick cluster of reeds near the edge of the water. The reeds were dense enough to provide some cover, but they could also act as an obstacle for whoever was following them. They could hide there, at least momentarily, and perhaps create enough of a delay to regroup. "Get ready to push us in," Purbright said quietly, but firmly, his voice barely audible over the water's steady flow. "We'll hide in the reeds. It'll slow them down, but we need to move now." Harrow nodded, his expression grim but resigned. He pushed the boat forward once again, guiding it through the dark waters toward the thick cluster of reeds. The boat scraped softly as it slid into the undergrowth, the reeds parting slightly to allow them entry. They both crouched low, disappearing into the cover of the thick plants, their breathing quiet but frantic. For a few heartbeats there was nothing but the soft rustling of the water and the breeze through the trees. Then the unmistakable sound of splashing filled the air again, only this time it was much closer. Someone or something was right behind them. Purbright's eyes narrowed, and he instinctively reached for the lantern, trying to shield the flickering light from view. His grip tightened around the revolver, his body tensing as the splashes grew louder, drawing nearer. The figure, dark and formless in the distance, was coming closer. Purbright's mind raced. Whoever was chasing them wasn't human. The way they moved, the speed at which they crossed the water, was unnatural. and yet they were too close now for Purbright to make out more than a silhouette. Then, just as the figure seemed to be right on top of them, a sudden burst of motion erupted from the water. A flash of white, unnatural, eerie, like the gleam of something metallic, flashed in the dim light, and Purbright's heart stilled. Whatever this thing was, it had found them. And now they were trapped. The figure, blurred and ominous, moved closer, its presence sending a chill through the already cold night. Purbright's breath caught in his throat as the metallic gleam he had seen a moment ago came into sharper focus. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something much more deliberate, something crafted, its glinting surface reflecting whatever faint light dared to reach the water. The thing was real, and it was coming for them. Harrow was frozen beside him, his wide eyes flicking from the shadowy form to Purbright, a mixture of dread and disbelief crossing his face. They were running out of time. The reeds rustled with every passing moment, each sound growing louder as the figure approached, moving unnaturally fast. Purbright could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed to move, to do something before whatever was out there reached them. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind remained sharp, cutting through the panic like a razor. "Don't move," Purbright whispered harshly, keeping his voice low, barely audible as the figure neared. It was just a few meters away now, its outline clear against the river's dark backdrop. Purbright's hand tightened around the revolver's handle, his fingers cold against the metal. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. The speed, the precision, it wasn't natural. Suddenly the figure stopped. It stood there, unmoving, as though it had sensed their presence, waiting for them to make the next move. The silence stretched between them like a thick web, each second dragging on longer than the last. Purbright could see the faint reflection of moonlight on the surface of the water, the ripples now moving unnaturally fast toward the shore. The figure's silhouette was jagged, almost angular, the metallic sheen now more pronounced in the darkness. Its body, if that's what it was, shifted in jerky movements, like a marionette, pulled by invisible strings. The more he watched, the more it became clear that this was no human pursuit. This was something else, something designed, crafted, and terrifyingly deliberate. He had a flash of realization. This thing wasn't hunting for them. It was sent for them. Harrow's family had gone to great lengths to keep it buried, to hide whatever secrets the vault contained. But it seemed that whatever was inside that book was far more valuable than they had ever understood. A slow, deliberate step forward, then another. The figure was closing in, the water around it swirling as it moved with eerie precision. Purbright felt his heart race, and instinctively he reached out and grabbed Harrow's arm, pulling him back farther into the reeds. They needed to stay out of sight, not move, not breathe too loudly. Every muscle in his body was tight with anticipation, but he forced himself to remain still, his pulse thundering in his ears. The figure hesitated again, as if sniffing the air, trying to locate them. It had no need to speak. There was something terrifying about the way it moved, the way it seemed to perceive everything around it without needing to touch or speak. It was as though it was just there, existing in the space between them. For a moment, Purbright thought they were safe. The figure stood motionless, and the night air seemed to still. Then, without warning, the creature lurched forward, its body snapping into a faster, more erratic movement. It was closing the gap between them, faster than Purbright had expected. The reeds on the bank rustled violently as it surged toward them, its movements a blur of unnatural speed. Purbright's breath caught in his throat. "Get to the boat!" he hissed, his voice a sharp command. The boat wasn't far, just a few more meters along the inlet. But the thing was moving far too fast. It wasn't just hunting, they were its prey. Purbright knew it, and now Harrow knew it too. The time for hesitation was over. With an almost animalistic instinct, Harrow shoved the boat away from the reeds, the small craft gliding silently into the deeper waters of the river. Purbright didn't wait. He pushed himself forward, using the last of his strength to propel the boat into the current. Behind them, the figure continued its pursuit, but they were moving. Harrow gripped the oars, his muscles straining with every pull as the boat surged forward, propelled by sheer fear. Purbright's mind raced as he scanned the river ahead. There had to be an escape route, a way to shake this thing to make sure it didn't catch them. The boat was small, but it was fast. He just needed to get them out of reach, out of the creature's unnatural pursuit. Another splash broke through the night, and Purbright's heart skipped a beat. The thing had jumped into the river. It was swimming toward them, faster than anything humanly possible. "Row faster, Harrow!" Purbright's voice was almost a shout, but it was drowned by the relentless splashing behind them. "Don't look back! Keep rowing!" The boat rocketed through the water, the current fighting against them, the splashes of the creature's pursuit echoing in the distance. The figure was close now, far too close. Purbright could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the thing closing in. There was nowhere to go, no place to hide. Just as it seemed the creature would catch up, Purbright heard a loud crack from behind them. Something large and heavy had broken through the reeds and into the open water. The creature was close enough now that he could hear the strange, wet, rasping sound it made as it moved through the water. Purbright glanced back, and for a moment everything froze. The thing was almost on top of them. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the moonlight. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of metal and flesh, its movements jerky and unnatural. And it was fast, too fast. Then suddenly the boat lurched as a wave of water splashed over the side, throwing Purbright off balance. Harrow cursed, trying to steady the oars, but the boat veered wildly. The creature was close enough now to touch the side of the boat, its metallic hand reaching for them. Purbright grabbed the nearest object, one of the loose oars, and swung it with all his strength. It connected with something solid, and the creature recoiled, hissing like an animal struck. "Row, row now!" Purbright shouted, his voice hoarse. They were almost there, just a little further, just a little more. Harrow's hands were shaking as he rowed, his eyes locked on the shore ahead. But the sound of the creature's pursuit, the wet rasp of its movements, never stopped. It was right there, right behind them. They were still running, still trying to escape. But Purbright knew one thing: it wasn't over yet. The town of Flaxborough was slipping away behind them, but the secrets buried within it were catching up fast.